Good morning again, and welcome to our third installment. We're focusing now on the life and works of Maimonides. We covered his wandering from Spain, Cordova, Spain, where he was born and raised as a child, and tutored by his father, who was a great sage in his own right. He flees and wanders because of the persecution of the fanatical Almohads, moves to Morocco, and after a few years, the persecution reaches him even in Morocco, and he flees to Israel. Israel was an intolerable place to settle. The place was overrun with bandits. It was a time of the Crusaders. It was not good for the Jews to live there, and he couldn't function there. So he then wanders off to Egypt. He moves from Alexandria to the suburb of Cairo. But in all this time, as he's fleeing, he's running, he's going through very difficult times. Maimonides had a very difficult life. He produces the greatest masterpieces of Jewish knowledge. In Morocco, he started working on his commentary of the Mishnah, which is a classic work. He wrote that in Arabic, actually in Hebrew letters, but Arabic language, thinking that the masses who didn't understand classical Hebrew would appreciate it written in Arabic. He later on regretted writing it in Arabic because he didn't realize the impact it had on the scholarly community for rabbis all over the world. At that time, the Jewish communities were scattered: Spain, North Africa, southern France, northern France, Babylonia, which was now became Iraq. Jews were scattered all over, and when they got the writings of Maimonides, they were overwhelmed with the brilliance and the depth and the mastery of all of Jewish knowledge that was reflected in his writings. And they demanded, we want his writings be translated into Hebrew. So when he wrote things into Arabic, he realized that it was going to be difficult for it to become accessible to the scholarly community. Now he's living in Fastad. He is now living a peaceful, relatively peaceful life, although it wasn't altogether peaceful. He was very much involved in a feud between the traditional Jews and the Karaites, who did not believe in the oral traditions of Judaism, and he had to fight the battle for the traditionalists. But relatively speaking, he enjoyed some peace, and he was ready to embark on his most bold initiative, his greatest work, which is the Mishneh Torah. That's the title he gave it, which we'll go into in a moment. But before he wrote the Mishneh Torah, he wrote another major classic work, the Book of Commandments. You know, they say this about rabbis, that before they speak, they like to say a few words. Well, before he wrote his major book, he wrote a major book as an introduction to his really major book. This Book of Commandments was written in Judeo-Arabic, as well as his earlier works, translated years later. And because it wasn't translated right away, it was left open for criticism. People didn't know the basis for his arguments. But what this book is, the Book of Commandments, is based on a tradition mentioned in the Talmud only once, that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Now, if you start counting commandments based on the Torah's telling you, do this or don't do this, there are many more than 613. That's the bad news. The good news is it's reduced to 613. Only joking, of course. But the number 613 sounds like an arbitrary number, and the Talmud divides it into two. There are 248 do's, positive commandments, or prescriptive, do this, do that, and 365 proscriptive, negative commandments. Don't do this, don't commit murder, don't commit theft, and so on. And the Talmud says that there's a reason for the numbers 248 and 365. 248 represent the number of bones in the human body, and 365 represent, as we all know, the days in a solar year. And Maimonides, in one of his writings, mentions that there's a message there. The message is that every bone in your body, every fiber of your being demands of you, do this, do this. and every day of the year exhorts you and reminds you not to do this and not to do that.
Sure.
So the total number, 248 and 365, is 613. There are some rabbis who said that's an arbitrary number. There's no real fixed number of commandments. You just count them if you want, and you'll find out how many there are. But Maimonides, as well as most other great scholars, believe that the number 613 was a very, very deliberate number. And centuries before Maimonides lived, in the 9th century, the 10th century, there were great rabbis who actually listed the 613 commandments. And here's where Maimonides got himself into trouble. He completely disregarded the way they counted 613. And Maimonides decided that he has to establish a different system, how to determine which is considered a commandment and which is not considered a commandment. How to count commandments. To give you an example, if a commandment is repeated many times, for example, observing the Sabbath is mentioned in the Torah at least a dozen times. Does that mean those are 12 of the 613? No, it's only one commandment, because it's the same commandment repeated over and over. Why is it repeated? Presumably because it's there for emphasis. That's why you repeat things, when you want to emphasize a point. But Maimonides was very clear. You can't just count commandments based on the way the Torah phrases it as a commandment. There has to be a system. So he wrote a book of commandments, and half of the book, a good part of the book, and it's the most important part of the book probably, are 14 ground rules to determine what is a commandment and what is not a commandment. For example, I have over here some of them. You don't count rabbinical commandments. Now, what do I mean by rabbinical commandments? In the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, we are told that if we have any questions, we should go by the rabbis who are the judges of Jewish law. So the rabbis instituted, for example, the holiday of Hanukkah. That's post-biblical. So his predecessors, those rabbis who enumerated the 613 before Maimonides, included that as one of the 613. And Maimonides says, no, you can't include that. Those are rabbinical commandments. They do not have the sanction, they don't have the status of a biblical commandment. That's one example. Another example is repetitive commandments that I mentioned before. Another one is some commandments have several components to them. You don't count each component as a separate commandment. You count the totality, all of the components combined. Another thing is that there are commandments that were told to the Jewish people when they left Egypt, when they were in the desert, when they built the tabernacle. Those were a one-time commandment. They're not relevant today anymore. So those commandments should not be counted. So Maimonides, after establishing these 14 ground rules, and as I mentioned in an earlier class, Maimonides loved the number 14. He was born on the 14th day of the month. Presumably that's the reason why he liked 14. There might be other deeper reasons. But after he enumerates the 14 ground rules, he lists all the 248 positive commandments and the 365 negative. And here's one new controversy. Maimonides' life, if we go through it, was filled with controversy. He was constantly doing things to awaken the ire of his contemporaries and later on of people who came after him. Maimonides was very bold. He wasn't afraid to challenge even the greatest rabbis who lived before him. And one could argue that Maimonides was the equal of any of the rabbis who came before him. And even though they were also great people, we're not talking about small people, Maimonides had respect for their knowledge, and he wasn't afraid to disagree with them. Now, Maimonides, for some reason, was obsessed with the 613, the number 613. While some rabbis said it's an arbitrary number, Maimonides was very, very much obsessed with the number 613, and he enumerates the 613 commandments no less than 4 or 5 times in his different works. He makes sure that you don't forget any of the commandments. But why did he write the Book of Commandments? Why was that such a priority for him? Because he was embarking on a major literary work, which was probably his greatest contribution to this day, and it's unparalleled in its scope and its depth and its precision, and that is the Mishneh Torah. So in order to understand what the Mishneh Torah is, then we'll understand why he had to write a book before he wrote the book. The Mishneh Torah was going to be an encyclopedic work, a comprehensive encyclopedic work that would contain all of Jewish knowledge, of Jewish practical knowledge, everything a Jew has to know in how he or she lives as a Jew, containing every area of Jewish law that was relevant in his day, and even laws that will become relevant in the Messianic age. He included those as well. And we'll talk more about his Messianic vision when we get to that point. But this is all part of his Messianic vision, that he didn't want people just to know about things that were practical now. He wanted people to look forward into the future. But this work was going to be a work of totality, leaving nothing out, to the point where commentators, of which there are hundreds, maybe thousands, will ask questions. How could it be that Maimonides omitted a certain law? It's untenable. And any other author, if they don't cover everything, you'd say, well, who says they have to cover everything? Did they ever sign a contract that they're going to cover everything? But Maimonides did sign such a contract, figuratively speaking, that I will cover everything there is to know about Jewish law, leaving out nothing. And if it seems that he omits something, that was a problem. People got, what happened to Maimonides? How could he have omitted it? And the commentators will give reasons for why he omitted it. And there's nothing left out in Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. But for Maimonides to embark on such a bold initiative, he had to be convinced that he had the ability to cover the whole panorama of Jewish knowledge. So he decided, you know what I'm going to do? Since there are 613 commandments in the Torah, I'm going to list the 613. But first I have to determine what is a commandment. Once I have the outline, I will be able to write the whole book itself. So the book of commandments, which he wrote as an introduction to his Mishneh Torah, was intended for himself to be able to cover all of Judaism by virtue of listing all the 613 commandments. And this work was controversial. It's one of the smaller controversies because he differed from all his predecessors who had a different way of systemizing and enumerating the 613 commandments. Let me give you just one example where there can be some debate about whether a commandment is a commandment. In the Torah, in Deuteronomy, it talks about how when Israel would go out to wage war, the Torah states, do not fear the enemy. Maimonides considers that to be a commandment, that you're not allowed to harbor fear when you're fighting a war, because that destroys the morale of the soldiers. If you're going to constantly talk about, oh, I'm terrified of this battle. So he considers that a commandment, that if you consciously and actively promote fear, that would be a violation of one of the 613 commandments. However, his major critic, and we'll talk more about him later, known as the Raavad, says, no, that's not a commandment. That's a statement that God is promising Israel that if you behave and you do what I say, when you will fight your enemy, you will not fear them. So it's not a commandment, it's just a statement of fact. So you can take a commandment, and then there are ways of interpreting it as a commandment, or you can interpret it as a statement of fact. That's just one example of how there can be practical differences between enumerating something as a commandment or not enumerating it. Now we get to the Mishneh Torah. About the year 1169, Maimonides was born in 1135 or 1138. You see, a controversy even about when he was born. But either way, he's in his 30s, and he embarks on this major work, his magnum opus. And its objective was to make the totality of Judaism accessible to all. He writes in his introduction that he is writing this work for everyone. He uses the Hebrew terms katan and gadol, the small or the young or the minors and the beginners and the adults, the majors, the ones who are more adult, more scholarly. He wrote it for scholars, and indeed the greatest of scholars to this day study Maimonides the same way they would study Talmud, the same way they would study the Bible. There are at least hundreds, I know of hundreds of books, commentaries on Maimonides, and there are probably thousands. And even books that don't directly comment on Maimonides, Mishneh Torah, they comment on the Talmud, will always steer to Maimonides. Everyone wants to know, what does Maimonides say? So when you study Talmud, the primary commentary is Rashi, the French rabbi who lived in the 11th century. Passed away in 1104, I believe. So everyone studies Rashi. But then, after you finish studying the Talmud with Rashi, you say, well, what does Maimonides say about this? Because you can't escape Maimonides' take on any aspect of Jewish knowledge. He covers the gamut. He covers everything. Now, Maimonides initially wrote the Mishneh Torah for one person, for himself. He says, you get older, you would know what that means, getting older. You're a bunch of youngsters here. But when you get older, you could forget. So he wanted to have a work that he could use for himself to remind himself of all the knowledge of Judaism. So now I'm young, I'm in my 30s, I can do it. And then when I get older, I'll have all the information available to me. But then he realized that he would be withholding such a valuable asset if he kept it for himself. And then he realized, he changed his attitude, that this is going to be a work for the entire Jewish people, for the entire world. Now, what's unique about the Mishneh Torah is its many things, but one of them is its structure, its organizational structure. When you study Talmud, the Talmud is divided into, the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud, is divided into 60 tractates. Each one has a different subject. And then the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah. Now, if you're studying, let's say, the laws of marriage, in the laws of marriage, there'll be discussions about other tangential subjects. And the style of the Talmud is a style of free association, where you go from one subject to a totally different subject because they have a common thread. So if you want to find all the laws of marriage, you can't just study the volume that talks about marriage. You'd have to study every other volume, because you'll find tidbits about marriage in every other volume connected to some other subject. And that's true about virtually every subject in the Talmud. And that makes Talmud study as a book for guidance very difficult. It's very challenging, because to know definitively what the Talmud says about any subject, you have to master the whole Talmud, and you have to know how to find it. What Maimonides did was, to, probably influenced by Greek aesthetics, was to take all of Jewish law and to systemize it in a way that you can find everything you want to know about the subject in one work, in one section. You don't have to go to another section. You have everything there. The system was incredible. And he divided his work into 14 volumes. Each volume has sub-volumes, a total of 83. And if you count the chapters, the whole Mishneh Torah has 1,000 chapters, exactly 1,000 chapters. Major, major work. Now, the numbers 14, I explained in an earlier class that Maimonides loved the number 14. He was born on the 14th day. But he also liked the number 83, because he mentions it as a fact that this work is divided into 83 subsections. And there's a theory that why he did that is because the Talmud refers to a certain category of illnesses, that there are 83 illnesses of a certain kind. And that's the numerical value of the word illness in Hebrew. The word illness in Hebrew, a machala, numerically adds up to 83. Well, we know Maimonides was a physician. He was a doctor. And he was not just a physician for the body, he was also a physician for the soul. Maimonides helped the Jewish soul as well with his writings. So he liked the number 83. He doesn't mention how many chapters. If you just counted them, you find out there were 1,000. But it's astounding to have 1,000 chapters. Now, up until Maimonides' writing of the Mishneh Torah, no work in Judaism has ever covered the whole gamut of Jewish law and Jewish knowledge. There is no such work. And since Maimonides, there has never been another work. There's another work that tried to copy Maimonides, but used Maimonides as his basis. So he didn't really innovate anything, and it's not even complete. But no one has ever duplicated Maimonides' scope. Now, if I would have told you that a professor, top-notch professor in any great university, was able to write a work like that, you'd say, yeah, of course, he had access to the internet, he had computers, he had 30 graduate students who were doing all the research, and of course, a professor was able to, after maybe 30 years, put together this brilliant work. Well, Maimonides, believe it or not, didn't have computers, he didn't have access to the internet, and he didn't have graduate students, and he didn't even have a pen, he had a quill. And with this quill, he was able to put together, besides all his other writings, he was prolific, and despite all his wanderings and all his tsaros, all his misfortunes, he was able to put together this incredible, incredible work. There's a tale, a tradition, written by a great Sephardic rabbi of the 19th century, that when he finished writing the Mishneh Torah, he fell asleep, and in his dream, his father, Rabbi Maimon, comes to him, escorted with Moses, the first Moses, and showing Moses his son's work, Moses Maimonides' work. And Moses looks at it, he says, Yasha Koach, more power to you. Thank you, that's great, it's a great work. They don't say these stories about other people. It just reminds me of a cute anecdote. There was a person who was on trial in Europe, and they brought in a great rabbi to be his character witness. And the lawyer, the defense lawyer, says, you know who this rabbi is? This rabbi had his store. His wife ran a store. That's how he supported himself. And a thief came in and grabbed something and started running. So the rabbi runs after him and says, I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you. It's yours. So the other lawyer says, do you expect us to believe that story? And the lawyer says, they don't tell stories like that about me or about you. The fact that they tell stories like this about someone means that this person is unique. This story illustrates the great reverence people had for Maimonides, comparing him to Moses, the first Moses. Now, what is unique about this work, compared to all the other great works of his predecessors, is that Jewish people were in exile. And exile was very tough. And in order to gain any knowledge of Jewish law, it was a luxury to be able to study. And you had to take advantage of every opportunity. So when the great rabbis wrote books, they only wrote about subjects that were relevant to the people at that time. They're not going to write about laws that will apply in the Messianic age. They're not going to write about how to build a holy temple on the Temple Mount. That was not relevant to the people at the time, and they couldn't just spend time on things that were not directly relevant, immediately relevant. Maimonides was different. He included everything, left nothing out. Every aspect of Jewish knowledge. He did another thing which was controversial, and that was that he included philosophical teachings. He starts off his Mishneh Torah with the knowledge, the actual few opening words are, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a God, a first existence from whom all other existence came. And then he goes on talking about God's existence, God's unity, his incorporeality, about the commandments to know God. And in Maimonides' writings, knowing God means to study physics and metaphysics. And that was very controversial, that he even included philosophy in his book of laws, and he was so strongly criticized and condemned for that. But the greatest criticism against Maimonides' Mishneh Torah came from his claim. Why was it called Mishneh Torah? What does Mishneh Torah mean? Mishneh Torah means the restatement or the repetition of the Torah. That's a phrase taken from the book of Deuteronomy, which is described in Deuteronomy as Mishneh Torah. Because what is Deuteronomy relative to the other 4 books of Moses? The 5th book of Deuteronomy is Moses repeating the teachings that were stated earlier. It's a repetition. It's a restatement. So Maimonides said that my work is also a restatement of all of Judaism. And he makes a bold claim that any Jew who wants to know how to be a Jew just has to study the Bible, biblical texts, and skip over everything else. Skip over the Talmud and just read my work. This was too much for his contemporaries and the people who had respect for his knowledge, but felt, who gives you a right to claim that you have the last word on Jewish law and you don't have to study any other works? That was one part of the criticism. Another part of the criticism is, it sounded like Maimonides was saying, no more study of Talmud, you don't need it. My work covers everything. Maimonides later on in a letter said that's not what his intention was. And in fact, Maimonides' work precipitated more Talmudic discussion than any other work in history. So it didn't take away from the study of Talmud. It just said that if you want to know how to live, you want to know practical advice and practical directives, how to live your life, you don't have to wade through the turbulent waters, the turbulent sea of Talmud. That's how the Talmud is often described, as a turbulent ocean. You don't have to go navigate the turbulent ocean. You could just read my book and it has everything in it. But that was also not accepted by his critics. They said, no, you can't skip over the Talmud. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean we have to accept it. Another thing, they said, Maimonides in his writings doesn't mention different opinions. The Talmud is filled with arguments. That's what makes the Talmud so great. It's filled with arguments, questions, answers, further questions, but different opinions. If you don't mention other opinions, how do we know that your opinion is the right one? Maybe the other opinion is the right one. If we don't know the other opinion, we can't decide. And then another criticism was he doesn't give sources. Now Maimonides in his introduction gives his sources for the entire work. He says that everything I write in this book, except where I note otherwise that it's my opinion, I'm taking it from the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Tosefta, the Midrash, and he goes on listing all the other works upon which he bases everything in his work, except for the few places, a few hundred places, where he gives his own opinion, and he mentions that this is my opinion. But you don't know what he's basing it on. So his critics said, if he gave us a source, we could examine the source, and then we could say, well, we don't interpret the source the same way he does. But if he doesn't give us the source, how could we argue with him? He's not giving us the opportunity to argue. And therefore, how could we follow him? That was the criticism. And you know what? Maimonides, years later, agreed with that criticism. Because someone asked him a question years later, where did you get this and this law? What is it based on? And he said, you know what? I'm not sure. And he thought maybe it's based on this source. No, it was the wrong one, maybe another one. Finally, he was able to remember the source, and he realized it was a mistake for me not to give sources. And he said, if I'm able to, I'm going to give the sources to the entire work. It didn't materialize. He never had the time to give the sources. But he realized that was a mistake on his part. So he accepted that criticism. But the other criticisms he did not accept. He didn't feel that he was taking away from the study of Talmud. He was just saying that you don't need the Talmud for guidance. You need it for scholarship, for the study. Now, just to talk a little bit about the way Maimonides wrote his writings. His first major work, he had a section where he enumerates the 13 principles of faith. And as we discussed last week, that was controversial for establishing a creed, principles of faith that you have to believe in. But Maimonides felt that Judaism is like building a structure. And you build a building, the first thing you have to build and secure is its foundation. If you don't have a solid foundation, the structure will not endure. But then some people and some religious persuasions put the entire emphasis on the foundation, and they forget about the structure. So Maimonides' next major endeavor was to build the structure of Judaism, the commandments. You can't just be a good Jew if you just have the right foundation, you have the right beliefs. You believe in God, you believe in God's unity, and all the 13 principles of faith. That's great, that's wonderful. But that's not Judaism, because Judaism is an entire structure. But after you know the structure and the foundation, what's left? When you build a building, you then have to put in the plumbing and the wiring and make the building functional. That was his philosophy, his guide for the perplexed, which we'll discuss, God willing, next week. Once you have the structure, you want to have the understanding of the structure. You want to know the reasons why we should do these commandments. We'll talk more about the whole entire exercise of looking for a rationale for commandments next week. But Maimonides felt that it was important that a person can't just have a foundation with a structure, and the structure, it has no light in it. You want the light there. You need the electricity. You need the fixtures. You need the plumbing to make it functional. That's what his guide for the perplexed is. So his whole life, he was going in order. First he establishes the foundations, then the structure, and then the illumination of the structure. Now his critics were not children. These were some of the greatest rabbis, and in some respects equaled Maimonides, at least in his Talmudic scholarship. Nobody had everything Maimonides had. Maimonides had everything, virtually everything. He had philosophical knowledge, he had Talmudic knowledge, he had medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge. None of his critics had everything. In fact, in his Mishneh Torah, he has a section called The Laws of Sanctifying the New Moon, where it's about 15 chapters of astronomy. It says, in order for a Jew to know how to establish the calendar, which is based on the lunar sightings, you have to know astronomy. So he has 15 chapters of astronomy. So his major critic, known as the Raavad, says, you got me here. This is not my field. I don't know anything about astronomy, so I'm not going to comment on it. Every other chapter he comments, and very caustically, but when it comes to the laws that involve astronomy, Maimonides was singularly competent in that field. Now, his greatest critic in his lifetime, because much of the criticism came later after he passed away, even a century or so later, but his major contemporary critic was the Raavad. Raavad is an acronym for Rabbi Avraham ben David, who was born in southern France in Pasquire, that's Provence, and he was the greatest scholar in Provence. And many people would say he was equal to Maimonides in Talmudic scholarship. He was a prolific writer, but there's one very significant difference. He didn't live a difficult life. Most of his life was calm, without having to wander and run from one place to another, without having to deal with the loss of children, with the loss of his wife, or the loss of his brother who supported him. All these terrible tragedies that befell Maimonides didn't happen to the Rabbi. He had one negative in his life. He was put in prison for a ransom. They just did it to get money, extract money from the Jewish community. And you know what he did in prison? He taught Torah. He says, I'm not missing anything. I'm paid for. I have room and board free, and I could just study Torah. So he had an easy life. So for him to be so great, you can't, well, you know, he had the leisure. He had the opportunity. But he was extremely brilliant. He was older than Maimonides. He was born in 1125, at least 10 years before Maimonides. And he was also very wealthy. And he's known for his charitable contributions. He supported students. And there was one area that he wrote that he was known to know, that Maimonides, we discussed this before, we don't even know if Maimonides had mastery over Kabbalah, over Jewish mysticism, because Maimonides doesn't touch it. And that's unusual for Maimonides not to touch something, because either he touched something to show his support for it, or he touched something to show his disregard for it. He doesn't talk about mysticism, and that mysticism was very much prevalent in those days, and the Raavad was a great mystic. But we don't know about Maimonides. There's some controversy about whether he was aware of mysticism. Now, Raavad was a very sharp man. He was very caustic. When he writes about Maimonides, when Maimonides writes something that he disagrees with, he'll use expressions such as, this is an error. That's the mild ones. And there are some more caustic ones, very, very sharp against Maimonides. But in one place he says, this man did a great work. He has to concede, you know what, I can't take that away from him. This is a monumental work that he did, which I disagree, much of it, hundreds of places where he disagrees. And you know what the funny thing is? He criticized Maimonides for writing a book without giving sources and without without giving the other opinions. In other words, it's not a book that should be studied because it could be misleading. And it's only because of his criticisms that the book became accepted. Because in every edition of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, you have his critical remarks. So we have both sides of the argument. And that's what made the Mishneh Torah much more accessible, much more acceptable. One thing about Mishneh Torah is that name was never used. For hundreds of years, nobody used that name. Instead, they renamed the Mishneh Torah as Yad HaChazaka, the mighty hand. We don't know who initiated that, but it was based on the last verse of the Torah, when God is giving the eulogy for Moses. And what does God say about Moses? That he demonstrated a mighty hand in the eyes of all of Israel. And the Hebrew word yad, hand, is 14. So someone, based on the fact that the Mishneh Torah is divided into 14 volumes, gave it a name, the mighty hand. But in giving such a name, it was saying that what Moses Maimonides did was a great marvel and equal to what Moses did, the first Moses. You can't get a greater endorsement than that. But why didn't they like the name Mishneh Torah? It's come back in the last few centuries. But for centuries, no one used that title. And the reason given is because they felt it was presumptuous. The book of Deuteronomy, one of the biblical books, is called Mishneh Torah, restatement of the Torah. How could we take someone else's writings and compare them to the Bible? So they felt that the name was a presumptuous name, and therefore they avoided using that name. But instead they created another name, which also compared Maimonides to the first Moses. But Maimonides also had other critics in every part of the world. He had in Baghdad, you had Rabbi Shmuel ben Eli. He was a great scholar. We're not talking about criticisms from people who were nobodies. We're talking about somebodies, people great in their own. Now, there was a major underlying feud between Maimonides and this Rabbi Shmuel. The feud was as follows. After the Talmud was sealed, in about the 5th to 6th century, the Talmud was written in Babylonia, the Babylonian Talmud. There are still rabbis living and teaching in Babylonia, although it was reduced to a much smaller population because the Jews migrated westward rather. Nevertheless, there were still substantial communities, and the heads of the academies were called Gaon. Gaon means genius or excellency. And the rabbis in Babylonia felt that they were the heirs of the Talmudic tradition beyond anyone else, that they carried authority beyond the authority of rabbis in other places in the world, because they were the heirs of the Talmudic sages. Maimonides did not accept that. Maimonides considered every rabbi who lived after the Talmudic period to have equal standing. You could agree or disagree with them. Now, obviously, you can't just disagree because you don't like what they say. You have to have solid proof of what your position is that disagrees with the other rabbis. But Maimonides felt that they don't have any unique status. So that was an underlying dispute. Also, the rabbis in Babylonia were supported by the community. They had official positions. Maimonides, as I mentioned last week, was totally against the idea that a rabbi should get paid by a community. In his mind, rabbis should get paid by their profession. That's why he was a businessman first, and he was a partner with his brother. When his brother drowned in the Indian Ocean, he started to become a physician and became one of the top physicians in the world at that time, the physician of Saladin and others. So that was an underlying feud between Maimonides and the rabbis in Babylonia. But then the rabbis in Babylonia also were against Maimonides for different reasons, the reasons that I mentioned before, that they felt that the whole Mishneh Torah was a presumptuous undertaking to claim that you don't need the Talmud anymore, that work is complete. So that was criticism from Baghdad. You had criticism from southern France. The Raavad was Mayor Abulafia. He was a rabbi in Toledo that was then Christian-controlled Spain, where the Crusaders recaptured that part of Spain from the Muslims. And under the Christian leadership, the Jews still flourished in Toledo, and he was against the Mishneh Torah. Now, the reason why he was against was more ideological than practical, the way the others disagreed. His problem was, and the problem of others as well, was the Rambam's belief system. The Rambam, Maimonides, I'm using those two names interchangeably, writes about a term used in the Talmud, Olam Haba, the world to come. What is the definition of the world to come? Which world is the world to come? It was always understood by all the Talmudic sages that it referred to the Messianic age when the dead will come back to life, the resurrection of the dead. That's the definition of the world to come. You have the world today, the way it is today, a world in which there is imperfection and death, and there'll be a perfect world in the future, in the Messianic age. Maimonides writes, no. He doesn't mention that. He says the Olam Haba is the life of the soul when it leaves the body. When a person passes away, the soul leaves the body and goes into a new spiritual world. So they took that to suggest that Maimonides does not believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that's why they were opposed to him. And this opposition was widespread. And Maimonides wrote a famous letter defending himself that he does believe in the resurrection of the dead. In fact, one of the 13 principles of faith that he enumerated in an earlier work, principle number 13, is the resurrection of the dead. So how could they say that he didn't believe in it? So they felt that the fact that he doesn't focus on it and he leaves it out in some of his discussions, that he had some doubts about it. That's how they understood it. But when Maimonides made it very clear that his belief in the resurrection of the dead is solid and it's based on the biblical sources, they recanted their arguments against him. At least this rabbi did, Romeo Balafia. So he had opposition from all over, from Baghdad, from southern France, from Spain, and likewise in his own country there were people who were opposed to him. But he weathered all these storms. Some of the arguments against him he responded to. Some he told his student, don't pay attention to it. Sometimes we have to just let them criticize. We don't base what we do on criticism. And many of his letters, you can see a lot of his humility, that although he trusted very much in his own opinions, he still had the humility to recognize that he could be wrong. If anyone has any questions, please feel free. We'll talk about the letter to Yemen next week, God willing. We'll try to finish this part of the series. Yes?
Several times you mentioned that certain words seem to have numerical value.
Right.
And
Okay, Hebrew doesn't have numbers. Hebrew uses letters for numbers, like if in English, instead of using 1, 2, 3, we use A, B, C. So every word in Hebrew is both a word and a number. And one of the methods of interpreting the Bible, there's 4 levels of methods. One of the methods is to look at the numerical value of a word and finding association with other words that have the same numerical value, showing that there's a connection between them. So, and it's interesting that the word Moses is referred to in Hebrew as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. Maimonides is referred to as Rabbeinu Moshe, our teacher Moses, the same 2 words, just inverted. Numerically, those 2 words add up to 613. So that's just a very interesting hint that maybe that explains their obsession with the number 613. Also, 6 plus 1 plus 3 adds up to 10. Rabbi Sadia Gaon, an 11th century sage, makes the claim that the 10 Commandments have 620 letters, 613 corresponding to the 613 biblical commandments, and the 7 plus 7 to the 7 Noahide commandments, the commandments that were given to Noah after the flood to keep civilization from falling apart. So a total of 620. So the 613 are really connected to the 10 commandments, which are really 10 statements. Any other questions? So God willing, next week I hope to cover the letter to Yemen. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah. We talk about the letters representing numbers. Does this system have place value? Does we get a base of 10 and so forth? Does it have that?
No, you have to use regular Arabic numerals to.
Just add them up.
Yeah, you just add them up.
Okay.